welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here, then welcome. My name is Maddie, and today I'll be doing a review on The Darkest Part of the Forest by Holly Black. I was not originally going to review this book until I remembered that I did review The Coldest Girl in Cold Town a few years ago, and I'll link that review on the screen and in the description box in case you want to see it. And because I reviewed that book, I do want to share my thoughts on this book, especially because I absolutely loved The Coldest Girl in Cold Town. I thought it was amazing, near flawless, so I thought I should also talk about Holly Black's other book, which I have not as great feelings for, but it was still a good book. So why don't we get into what this book is about, just in case you don't know. This is an urban fantasy. It takes place in this town, where in the forest of this town there are fairies who live there. And in the forest there is this fairy boy who is a prince, and he is asleep in this casket. He's been asleep for years, and he's become a tourist attraction to visitors who come to town and they want to see the prince that never wakes up. That is until our main character, Hazel, discovers that the prince has awoken. So, like I do my reviews on books and on anime, in fact, I will mention the things I liked about it and the things that I disliked about it. So let's go into the positive first. One thing I did love about this book was the atmosphere. This book takes place in a world where there is the modern everyday world that we're used to, but also there's this aspect of fairies. And that's not something I read about in regards to fantasy often. Usually when I read a fairy book, it's usually in a world that's fantastical, not the real world. However, this book does take place in the real world, and I like that. I like reading about things that have a modern day setting, but also have this fantastical element to it that makes the world so much more interesting. And actually, urban fantasy is the type of thing that I also like to write, so it was cool reading an actual urban fantasy. And the atmosphere in this book was really well done. It was written well. I could easily picture all of the settings, and it definitely did have this eerie feeling to it, since the fairies in this book are pretty sinister and evil, as fairies usually are, at least the fairies in books. I would say like Disney type fairies are more, how would you put it, happy, innocent, but book fairies, especially in this one, are more darker, and they were described in a way that really did give off that eerie feeling to them. Another positive about this book was my favorite character in this one, which is Jack. He was so interesting. He's not even the main character, but his whole story and backstory is so fascinating. So he is actually a fairy who was raised in the human world. What happened exactly is he was, what do you call them? They start with a C, I think, but I cannot remember the type of fairy that the actual term for them. But basically he was exchanged for a human baby, and so the fairies took this human baby and exchanged Jack for him, so they gave Jack to the humans, and eventually the human baby did end up back with his human family, because the real mother was like, give me my baby back, you fairies, you dumb fairies, give me my baby back. I would do the same thing, but this human mother also insisted on raising Jack because she did not want to leave him with the sinister fairies. So in turn, Jack was raised as a human, but the thing is, throughout this book, he battles with his life as a human and as a fairy, because as a fairy he does have those tendencies to go with other fairies and be with them to their parties and all that. So he battles with being a human, staying in his human life, but also battles with wanting to be a fairy and follow the traditions of fairies. And I thought that was so interesting. I like the double life that he had, and how when he would have those tendencies to let his fairy side come out, he would be a lot more darker in personality. I really like that, and honestly, if this book had just been all about Jack, I would have loved this book a lot more. It probably would have been a 5-star because he was so fascinating. So I do really wish this book was just had been all about Jack, because the main character that we do follow, she was good, but she was nowhere near as interesting as Jack was. Just the whole idea of a fairy struggling to stay human because that's the life he's used to and was raised in, but also having this internal struggle to want to be a fairy because that's his instinct. So freaking fascinating. Like, I just loved him. And his actual character, he was so freaking sweet. And minus the parts when he would be dark because he is a fairy. But overall, he was so sweet, so cute, man. I loved him so much. Definitely my favorite character in this book. But those were the positives. Now let's get into the negatives. I do have a few. So the biggest negative I probably have about this book is that it was so slow. It took me such a long time to get into it. It wasn't until maybe page 200 where I actually started to get a little into this book. Everything before that was torturous to get through. I hate putting it like that, but it really was. It took me forever to read this book, and honestly, I know I mentioned once that I put this book down a few years ago because I was not getting into it, but because The Coldest Girl in Cold Town was such a great book, and Holly Black also wrote that book, I really wanted to give this book a chance, so I picked it up again and restarted it because I had forgotten everything, and just trudged through it, just waiting for it to get better. And eventually it did. I think towards the latter half of the book, it does pick up. Things start to get more interesting. There's plot twists and all that. But in the first part, it's really hard because nothing really happens in the first part. It's just a whole bunch of mystery happening, talk of stuff happening, a lot of talking, and that's it. So I don't think the pacing of this book was all the way there. However, like I said, it did pick up in the end, so I was grateful for that. Another disappointment about this one is the prince himself. So the synopsis of this book makes it seem like the prince, the fairy prince that's been asleep for years in the casket, is going to be a major main focus, but he really isn't. And I felt like the book built him up and hyped him up so much, and the payoff of his character just was not there for me. I would have liked to go more in depth to his character specifically, but I feel like the actual depth that we do get on the prince is really glossed over and not explored properly, to where I didn't really feel for him. I didn't care for him at all. I thought he was just bland, boring, didn't find him interesting. And going into this book, I did want to like the prince because I thought he was the main focus of this book, when in actuality he really isn't. And so I felt like I went into this book expecting something and then being totally blindsided, and that wasn't what I got. And I wanted to get to know the prince. That's one thing I was excited about going into this book, but you don't really ever get to know him as well as personally I would have liked to. If this book was a series and not just a standalone, I would be okay with that, because then I would think, oh, maybe later on we will get to know more about the prince and his story and all of that. But this is a standalone, so this is all that we get, so we're not ever really going to get to know more about him. So in total, my negatives have to be the pacing was slow, and some of the characters weren't as interesting as I thought they were going to be, hence the prince. And also Hazel herself, I just couldn't personally relate to her. I wouldn't have chose her as a main character that I would have liked to follow. But going along with the positive, if this book had been told in Jack's perspective, man, if it had been all about him, I would have loved this book. It's like such a missed opportunity. Like, I want to read a book about a character who is a fairy that is raised in the human world. I would definitely read a book like that. That sounds so freaking cool. I wish I could remember the term for them. I know they start with a C. A changeling, that's it. Jack was a changeling. Oh, it just came to me. I'm like, it starts with a C. That's the term for him. A fairy that was exchanged for a human baby. and so the fairies like took the human baby, which Jack's brother also is what's his name? I think it's Caden. He's the human baby who was taken by the fairies, and they actually do become real close because they were raised together. So yeah, Jack and Caden, man, I really love those characters. I just wish this book would have been all about them. So this book was not as good as The Coldest Girl in Cold Town. Unfortunately, I gave it 3 out of 5 stars, which just means it was okay. It was fine, but it wasn't great. The Coldest Girl in Cold Town is definitely way better in my opinion. But I have heard people who do love The Darkest Part of the Forest, so don't let my opinion sway your thoughts on it if you haven't read it yet, because there are readers who do like and love this book. It just didn't meet my expectations. It kind of let me down in some parts, but definitely do give it a try if it sounds like something you are interested in, because everyone's opinions are different. These were just mine. I specifically picked this book up right now because I do want to read The Cruel Prince, I think it's the Folk of Air series, but I wanted to read this book first because this is a spin-off of The Cruel Prince, and I'm weird like that. I have to read the original book that the world takes place in before I read the spin-off. I'm just like, you don't have to do that, but that's the way I like to do things. When it comes to books that are spin-offs, I have to read the original book that takes place in the world first. Yeah, it's totally unnecessary, but that's just the way I like to do things. So that's why I read this book right now. So now I can get to The Cruel Prince whenever, and I do want to read that series really soon because I've heard so many good things about it, and I've heard that it is better than The Darkest Part of the Forest. So I'm kind of hyped for it. Can't wait to get to it really soon. So I hope you enjoyed my review of The Darkest Part of the Forest. If you did, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more book-related videos, book reviews. Also, I do anime-related videos here, so if that's something you're interested in, then definitely do stick around. And I'll see you guys really soon. Bye.